thanks very much to the East Asia Institute for inviting me. And thank all of you for coming here on Friday afternoon in Chiangmai. So this is wonderful, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say. And what I thought I would do, I will follow Professor Ku's suggestion, and I won't present the paper the same way, but I'll explain how I got to this question and why I think it's important. And it's this question right here: was it an international system? And the reason I started to ask this is when I was an undergraduate and when I was a graduate student studying political science and international relations at some very good universities at Stanford and Berkeley, I learned all about European history. Every IR class I had, we learned about Westphalia and Habsburg Empire and World War I and World War II. And I had zero discussion of East Asian history in IR. To the point my father would tell me a story about the turtle boats, right, and some guy. But I had no idea that was the Imjinweran. I mean, I sort of knew Japan invaded and he fought them off, right? Until I started this research, I didn't know whether Tang came before Ming. And I have a PhD from a good university, and I'm considered to be a scholar of East Asia. And I am not alone. Most American or Western-trained IR people who do East Asia have no idea about this history. For them, history is Japanese colonialism. That's where it ends. And I got interested for a number of reasons. I said, well, wait a minute now. Was anything different about East Asia, or can we simply use our models, which are all derived in the American international relations field? All our models are derived from the European experience. Balance of power, liberalism, nation states, Westphalia, all of our theories that we assume are universal are actually derived from a historical experience in Europe. So I got interested because in many ways I'm a sort of Korean national. Right? I want East Asia to be taken seriously on its own terms. And I got tired of people saying, well, what was Europe like? What was Europe like? When they try and explain Asia. So I started to look at it. And I asked, is it an international system? Was it something different? Or can we just simply import European models and they work fine? So that's my fundamental question that I've been doing. And I have a book that came out which makes a very strong argument that East Asia had a very different pattern of international relations that didn't look historically like the European pattern, and today doesn't really look like we expect our simple European models of balance of power or economic interdependence. So I've taken a very strong stance that we need to understand East Asia by itself. It doesn't mean it's completely different, because I'm using categories that we derive from the European experience, right? These are how do we measure war? What do we call this? But the empirical patterns are different. And so I've been pushing on actually war, because that's one of the central ways in which we think about international relations. I mean, it's the big thing everyone studies. So if East Asia is really different, we should start by studying, was there a different pattern of war? And then we can start asking other things. But if basically the same kind of fighting and the same patterns of war, then it's not that interesting. And so I'll skip past all my little pet peeves, right? Because there's a lot of things so the people I am arguing against, and the people this research is aimed at, is mainstream Western scholars who don't think they need to know anything about East Asia, or think that only the European system is universal. And many of the ways that we think about East Asia I find very troubling. So I'm just going to talk about one, which is we tend to assume East Asia was just stagnant, just the same for 2,000 years. And what I call, there was a movie, it's called Groundhog Day, and I don't know if any of you ever saw this movie with Bill Murray. But he's doomed to repeat this one day, Groundhog Day, over and over and over again, right? And that's the way we tend to think about East Asia in the United States. From 5,000 years ago till the West came and changed Asia, it was all the same, just one dynasty after another. And I actually think if we go through this, there are It's very linear, right? We get emergence of states of something centralized rule in China a couple centuries before zero. In the 4th to 5th centuries, we then get states or centralized rule emerging in Korea and Japan. 500 years later in Vietnam, we get Tokugawa. I mean, it's not cyclical at all. It's very, very linear in a sense. There's real differences. So what I decided to do is focus on one era, a very modern era. Things back here would have been very different. I'm not claiming this was always the case. But I decided to focus on one era in which states were relatively well developed, in which we have good history about and everything else, right? My second pet peeve, and I think this will make sense to people in Korea, is China and the West. Because if you read books in America about East Asia, or sinologists who think China is Asia, and so you see books about China and the West, China and the West. Why didn't China develop where Europe actually developed capitalism? And it's like, wait a minute. Why aren't you saying, why didn't East Asia develop capitalism? Right? So although obviously China's huge, and we're going to get back to that, I really wanted to take a regional view. Not just China, but how did Vietnam interact, and Korea-Japan relations? And in fact, the book looks at nomads as well. Right? Because I'm really tired of people who study China thinking they can speak with authority about the entire region. No offense to that. Right? Those of you who study China. It's important, but it's not hardly the only political unit. And these countries on the periphery had very unique, individual, proud histories. So I really think we need to take a regional view, and we can't just study China and then claim we know the region. And I'm going to skip that, right? And you guys know how I sort of measured it. But what I'm briefly going to point out, one of the things I'm proud of, and this is going to go up on a website as soon as I can get it worthwhile, is I took 중국 역대 전쟁 연표. I did it myself because everyone quotes this, and you may know this quote that says China fought 1.4 wars every year for 2,000 years. And they use this compilation. And there's actually a 한국 역대 전쟁 연표 as well. It's very interesting, right? The same thing. You go through the, Samguk Yusa, and you say blah, 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 right? But that relies on a very superficial reading, right? So I got 825 observations. And this is an example of my database, right? Where 1402, there's a rebellious prince. You have to count every single incident here. Right? And if we're going to measure war, we need some way to measure it. Wegu pirates, and then pirates who aren't Wegu, and et cetera, et cetera. So what I did is I tried to make some distinctions. And I tried to say, was it a border war? Was it a war of over 1,000 deaths, which is the way we tend to define it in the West? Right? Was it pirate raids? And some examples. Here are the sums, which I put in the paper, so I won't do it, right? But briefly, what I'll point out is that overall, if you take the Chinese record, 3/4 were border skirmishes with the nomads, right? They had horrible times on their frontier, which makes sense. The frontier was this vast region with amorphous boundaries and distances and everything else. Actual amount of wars that would count the way Westerners count, or the way that we IR people count, is exceedingly small. Meaning massive mobilizations of troops with 1,000 battle deaths and extermination of countries, right? And in fact, as we all know, the border between China and Korea has basically been the Yalu River since about 1034. This is remarkable stability, especially compared to the European experience, where European borders changed, kings lost, and they fought and they changed back and forth, right? That this can remain the border for roughly 9 centuries is basically astonishing stability. This, of course, again, is very frontier region, and over the centuries, by the 15th century, then both the Yalu and the Tumen were the border. And Vietnam is basically the same way. In about 1078, China and Vietnam agreed on where the border was. And that border at Lang Son is basically the same border that they agreed on today in 1999. So it's very, very interesting patterns of stability and war that don't track to the European experience. So how do we explain this? And I'll just briefly flesh this out a little bit, which is I think that there are, in the abstract, there's two general patterns for international relations, two general types of systems. One might be, the best example might be the European system, which we would call a balance of power system. A bunch of similarly sized countries contend for power. But just as likely, or certainly we have a good example here, are what we might call hegemonic or unipolar systems, in which you've got an extremely powerful civilizational country and around it a bunch of smaller countries. And this can be actually quite stable. I'll give you two other examples. The Indic region, they generally call hegemonic. And then obviously the United States and Latin America. We didn't invade Mexico and Colombia and Brazil and everything else, but all those countries are clearly smaller than the United States. And I'm happy to talk more about definitions and what I mean, the difference between hegemony and unipolarity. The one point I'm going to make is that unipolarity, I define unipolarity as basically being more big, powerful. And hegemony has an implication of legitimacy to it. So whether you think that China was stable simply because it was bigger and beat everybody else up, then you think it's a unipolar system. And a hegemonic system is one in which there's some legitimacy or authority accorded to the largest country. We're asking that today. Is the United States a hegemon? Certainly in Korea, there's a lot of legitimacy for the United States, right? Or is the United States just the biggest country? It's just a unipole. And this is, I think, where most of the debate will come about China, historically, right? But briefly, and then I'll go on. Clearly, it was a hegemon. This is population and GDP. I love this chart, right? In 1600, almost any way you measure it, by population and the size of the economy, China was gargantuan compared to other countries. It was Japan. I just put France and UK at that time in there, right? Here's East Asia, Korea, Vietnam, and Japan. Here's China, 1820. So it's clearly a unipole. It's clearly bigger than everybody else. And this is where I will be very interested to hear about intellectual history and Confucianism, right? But there was also an aspect of what we might call something Chinese civilization. There were no Chinese notions that Koreans found legitimate. Frankly, the Japanese found legitimate. The Japanese, all the katakana and hiragana are based on versions of Chinese language. They imported ideas. Japanese emperors were buried with Chinese cultural items, status items like combs and jade and things like that, right? And frankly, Vietnam did the same thing. They borrowed the same examination system. Vietnam and Korea. Vietnam as well had the same 6 ministries as China. So there was an element of emulation and legitimacy, as well as simply China being bigger. Clearly there were groups that rejected Chinese civilization. They didn't have motorcycles in 1600. This is not a photo from 1800, but right? You know, I mean, there were groups that decided they didn't want to be Chinese. They didn't want to have written records and bureaucracies. And interestingly enough, the groups that liked Chinese civilization tended to have very stable relations. And the groups that didn't like Chinese civilization tended to fight all the time. You know, and I didn't write this in the paper and I didn't write this in the book because it didn't occur to me at the time. But we don't have a problem saying democratic states don't fight. There's an institutional explanation, but there's also a cultural, there's a value explanation for why democracies don't fight. They have similar values about respect for human rights and blah, 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 right? And we don't have a problem saying democratic states didn't fight. But in a way, I think it's not surprising that Confucian states didn't fight that much. It's a similar thing, right? I mean, there probably are institutional and power reasons, but there's probably also a value or a cultural reason as well. So let me quickly conclude that I think it's hard to make a pure power-based argument. That these countries couldn't fight, they weren't strong enough, they couldn't invade each other, because when they decided to fight, the fighting was massive. On a scale that European countries, oops, I don't have it there. On a scale the European countries couldn't match until the 19th century. I think I put this in the paper, but the Spanish Armada, which occurred at the same time, the Spanish Armada of 1588 was called the greatest military force of Europe ever seen. And it was 30,000 Spaniards defeated by 20,000 English troops. I mean, the scale is literally 5 or 10 times. When they wanted to fight, they could mobilize troops and move them across water on a scale unimaginable in Europe. So it's not that they couldn't fight. China could march troops 2,000 miles across the desert to wipe out the Mongols. They just chose not to wipe out Vietnam and Korea the same way.
Europeans were professional armies.
Yeah. They also used mercenaries, right? And so just briefly, so that we can get on to your discussion, right? What I find fascinating about this is that it widens our view of what international relations might be. I mean, in some ways, I gave this talk at Georgetown, and one grad student said, so what? So why should I care? Right? Big deal. And I said, actually, if I'm right, this is a fundamental challenge to the way we think about international relations. That we take for granted as permanent and universal the European state system and the way that these countries interact. And we're very skeptical that hegemony can be stable or that anything alternative might exist. And in fact, this, if I'm right, or if I'm even close to being right, what it means is there's a wide variety of ways that IR might work. And the current way, couple centuries. It's very recent. It may change again. So who I'm aimed at is actually IR scholars. And the types of people who don't need this convincing, actually, are historians. They're the ones who keep trying to say it's not just culture, there's power that matters as well. And I'm the one who keeps trying to say, because they're talking to historians who know the deep, rich history of East Asia. And I'm the one who's trying to get IR people who never even think about this stuff to take it seriously. So I will stop there, and I'll be delighted to hear what you all have to say. So thank you very much.